Welcome to Research Talk. I hope you all are doing well and enjoying our journey together on phenomenological research designs. In our previous videos, we talked about two research designs. We talked about Giorgi's descriptive research approach to phenomenology. We also talked about von Manen's interpretative approach to phenomenology. In today's video, we're going to talk about another approach to phenomenology, which is Dahlberg's approach. And this approach is known as reflective Lifeworld Research approach. If you remember, Giorgi's approach is primarily inspired by Husserl approach, and it focuses on a detailed description of the phenomenon under investigation. Von Manen approach is primarily inspired by Heidegger, and it focuses on interpretive meaning and the process of how people assign meaning to their experiences. So more focus on interpretive hermeneutic, and the Giorgi's approach is more on description of the phenomenon. Dahlberg's approach, we cannot put it in any one of these categories. I would say it moves across these two approaches, so both descriptive as well as interpretive. Dahlberg's approach is radical in some ways. Unlike other approaches which are trying to study a phenomenon more systematically in the sense that you have a step-by-step predetermined process of conducting research. Dahlberg's approach is radical, that she says that phenomenological research studies, if you are trying to make it very structured, then it may be difficult to understand how a phenomenon is presenting itself to you as a researcher. So her approach can be categorized as less structured approach. So when you are starting your study, you spend some time determining the focus, determining the phenomenon that you are investigating, and then you start from there. As you start determining who do you want to collect data from, what kind of phenomenological materials you want to gather for your study. So you are making those decisions as you progress in the study. So this approach provides you less structured and is open to tweaking or doing some experimentation, changing as you progress in the research. A key feature of this approach is openness as well. Openness of, as I said already, that openness in the sense of methodology, which is like less structured approach in choosing participant, gathering phenomenological materials for your study, and also when you are doing your analysis. So like other approaches where we use whole analysis, Dahlberg's approach also does the same. They use it, but they are open to try some other ways to understand the phenomenon. So in terms of data, they are open to try maybe like observation or different ways of understanding a phenomenon. So again, the idea is, as a researcher, you are more open to the phenomenon that you are investigating. Another important and key feature of this approach is, as a researcher, you are very reflective and contemplative as a researcher throughout the research process. So one way this suggests to do that is slow down and dwell on the phenomenon. Slow down and dwell on the phenomenon. So as you start the research, your phenomenological research, you she asks you to slow down, in the sense that unlike other approaches where obviously as a researcher you have your deadlines, you have your funding, your deadline that you want to meet and all those things. However, in this approach, it is very important to immerse yourself in the phenomenon, dwell on the phenomenon. So as a researcher, you are spending time to look at the phenomenon in so many different ways. You are dwelling with the phenomenon, meaning that you are spending a lot of time at each phase of the research process, dwelling, reflecting. So that's what it means, that you need to slow down and dwell on the phenomenon as a researcher. So reflective and being contemplative is very, very important. They also argue that as you slow down and dwell on the phenomenon, it helps you to let the phenomenon reveal itself to the researcher. So the phenomenon, whatever it is you are trying to understand, explore, when you dwell, when you spend time, when you are being contemplative, reflective, the phenomenon reveal itself to you. You don't need to just chase down the phenomenon. It will reveal if you dwell and be with the phenomenon. So again, reflecting the same idea, being a reflective, thinking, contemplative approach to conducting research. When you slow down and be more contemplative and immerse yourself on the phenomenon, it helps you also to understand how you influence the phenomenon and how the phenomenon influence you. And this is a very important point too. As a researcher, when we engage, when we dwell, when we reflect, when we contemplate, we are constantly interacting with the phenomenon. In that process, the phenomenon is going to be, we are being influenced by the phenomenon, and also the phenomenon influence us. So we need to be mindful, we need to be contemplative, reflective, to really understand this whole dynamic of how we as a researcher are being influenced, or the phenomenon is influencing us as a researcher. So being reflective and contemplative is highly emphasized in Dahlberg's approach. The third important concept that Dahlberg's provided in his approach is he emphasized a lot on the context. So when, as a researcher, you are conceptualizing the phenomenon, make sure you situate the phenomenon in its context. Similarly, when you are reflecting, when you are thinking about the research question, the guiding research question or sub-questions, again, the same rule applies. You spend considerable time to situate your research questions in the context as well. Similarly, when you are gathering phenomenological materials, that's when also you situate, when you are making decisions, so what kind of phenomenological materials you want to collect. So those decisions should always be contextualized. Further, during data analysis as well, it needs to be contextualized, which means that if you are doing a whole analysis, this method itself has that feature to contextualize the findings both holistically and partially in its part. So context matters a lot under Dahlberg's approach, reflective Lifeworld approach of conducting phenomenological research study. Finally, Dahlberg's key contribution in his method is bridled attitude. So we all remember that Husserl used to study a phenomenon, he used a term called bracketing, epoch. So bracketing is used in approaches such as Giorgi's approach or Max Venon's approach. Dahlberg said that bracketing is not as useful. So what she did, she created this new concept called bridling. And what is bridling? Bridling is developing awareness of your own preconceptions. So remember, in bracketing, what we do, we are asked as a researcher to bracket, to suspend all our preconceived notions. Dahlberg argued that this is not feasible, this is not practical. We are human beings. A better approach to achieve those goals is through bridling, where instead of suspending all our prior experiences, perceptions, and beliefs and values, we as a researcher to focus on developing awareness, becoming more aware of my own values, beliefs, perceptions, experiences, preconceived notions about the phenomenon. So that awareness will help us to bridle, to see the phenomenon as it is and not become biased when we are exploring the phenomenon. So developing awareness. Another method he suggests is ongoing reflection. As a researcher, if you are adopting this approach, you have to be being reflective across the process, across the whole research process. It's not like you are doing this reflection when you are writing your field note or you are writing your memo. This is required for you. It's like a way of being a phenomenological researcher under this approach. So huge emphasis on ongoing reflection. And as we already pointed out and discussed, she also recommends slowing down and dwelling on the phenomenon. Slowing down and dwelling will lead to bridling, where you can be more aware of your own preconceived notion, and that will help minimize your own biases when you are exploring the phenomenon. And finally, maintaining openness. This is very similar to what we talked earlier also. The whole method of Dahlberg's reflective life world is focused on less structure, more openness across the research process. So in summary, this approach of conducting phenomenology is less structures. It gives you as a phenomenological researcher more freedom to choose, to reflect, to decide, and be a little bit more experimental when you are exploring the phenomenon. So another thing to keep in mind is you are focusing more on the context as well. So whether it's determining the research question, your focus of your study, or data collection strategies, data analysis strategies, at each and every phase, you are reflecting, spending time on the context. So you are situating all these research questions or phenomenon in its context. So there is a huge emphasis on the context. And finally, in this approach, the most important contribution of Dahlberg's approach is bridling. Dahlberg used to, while growing up, she used to live on a horse ranch. And that's where this word bridling came up. So this is her contribution to phenomenology when it comes to how we can set aside our own perceptions, our own preconceived notion about the phenomenon so that we could see the phenomenon as it is, so that we could let the phenomenon reveal itself to the researcher. So bridling is a very important concept introduced in this methodology. So that's briefly about Dahlberg's reflective open world research approach. I'll see you in another video talking about more about doing phenomenological studies. Thank you very much and have a good rest of the day.